everybody, I'm KC, and welcome to another edition of Let's Talk About, and welcome to the latest installment of Sherlock and the Curious Critic. Now the consoling detective and the good doctor have settled into Baker Street, let's take a look at their first proper case together, the blind banker. While John is trying to deal with their financial struggles, Sherlock is called in to investigate mysterious symbols appearing around London, followed by a string of murders. So Sherlock and John race to find the culprit while also learning how to work together as a team. Ah, the blind banker. Remember when this was considered the bad one? Those were the days. And even back then, I feel like that reputation was a bit undeserved. The Blind Banker is still a fun outing with the modern Holmes and Watson. Is it as good as A Study in Pink? Well, no, but that's a really tall order. Is it as good as most of the episodes that follow? I mean, that is... Again, tall order. Alright, let's talk about something this episode does do better than its kin. Establishes the status quo. While the first episode has the essential job of introducing and establishing everything, the second episode has to wind things down and give us a sense of how the series is going to feel on a more regular basis. And I think that's where the Blind Banker shines, especially with Sherlock and John. Sure, they had a nice little romp of chasing and almost succumbing to serial killers, but the honeymoon phase is over and they've got bills to pay. While A Study in Pink showed that at the end of the day, these two are better off with each other, this episode shows that they are still very different people, and how difficult it is for John to live with Sherlock's eccentricities every single day. Heck, the first time we see them in this episode is cutting between John getting frustrated and not being able to buy groceries, while Sherlock is brawling with, I think, a mercenary in their flat. It's a pretty fun way to show these two worlds trying to live under the same roof. Like I said before, while most adaptations like to just get to the inseparable, iconic duo, only recently have some adaptations come to realize that while Holmes and Watson are compatible, they are also vastly different, and have had fun with the idea of how John might really feel about the rooms always being a mess, or experiments going on in the apartment at all hours, or being dragged off on cases at the cost of a social life. And Sherlock brings that concept to the forefront in a very entertaining and engaging way, mostly by weaving those growing pains into their work on the case together. The mystery itself is fine, all things considered, though not nearly as compelling as its predecessor or the mysteries to follow, which might explain the lukewarm reception this episode tends to get. I want to emphasize that the mystery isn't bad or convoluted. The pieces fit and the progress is satisfying as the investigation goes on, but the whole thing is not nearly as interesting as other adventures to come. But how does the case of the Blind Banker measure up to its novel counterpart? Well, for that, it's time for... While A Study in Pink was more or less directly inspired by the first Sherlock Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet, The Blind Banker is more of a mishmash chimera of mystery elements from the Sherlock Holmes canon to create a new mystery. The biggest inspirations were The Dancing Men, which was another mystery connected to an unusual cipher. The key to the cipher being found in a book is a plot point in The Valley of Fear, and the murderer getting into locked rooms through unconventional and possibly ridiculous means is one of the most famous developments in the Sign of Four, as well as the condescending inspector who doesn't believe in Sherlock's methods.
You're Ned.
Yeah, I know who you are, and I'd prefer it if you didn't tamper with any of the evidence.
We'll get back to him. Speaking of the big locked room mystery, Sherlock has a great line here.
Wrong.
It's one possible explanation of some of the facts. You've got a solution that you like, but you're choosing to ignore anything you see that doesn't comply with it.
That could be a rewrite of a very famous line from A Scandal in Bohemia. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories, instead of theories to suit facts. Though that one might be a stretch on my part. But, to be honest, that's about it. One of the weirdest things about The Blind Banker to me is that it seems to go out of its way to not reference the books. I get that they might have wanted to relax a bit after how many references they put into A Study in Pink, but when you've got opportunities to do them staring you in the face, why waste them? The most egregious examples are the new characters introduced in this episode. For reasons that continue to elude me, the inspector who is dismissive of Sherlock's contributions is Inspector Dimmock, played by Paul Checker. At least I think that's how you pronounce that. Not a book name to my knowledge, but there were several other well-known representatives of Scotland Yard they could have borrowed a name from, like Gregson, or hell, why not Jones? You know, the inspector this guy is clearly inspired by, and was the Inspector Holmes Holmes worked with in The Sign of Four that this scene is clearly paying homage to? What the heck? Not only that, but the person who calls them on this case in the first place is one of Sherlock's classmates from university. I hesitate to use the word friend in this case. Named Sebastian Wilkes, played by Bertie Carvel. Once again, there was not one, but two options for naming references to the books here. Reginald Musgrave and Victor Trevor, with Sherlock having mentioned them when talking about investigations he took part in during his university days. But while this one is a bit more excusable with the benefit of hindsight, it bothered me for years why they didn't use either of the names given to them on a silver platter, especially since Holmes' days at university are one of the few things from the books we know about his life pre-Watson. Though maybe it's for the best that Musgrave and Trevor were spared being associated with Sebastian, because he's kind of an asshole. Continuing the trend of people who know Sherlock who are annoyed at his abilities and intelligence, even calling him a freak like Donovan does. And it's in that way that people do where they think they could just wave it off as, come on man, it was just a joke. Ugh, I hate that. And this is him asking Sherlock for a favor. And what would a jerkwad character be without dismissing the death of his employee and only accepting the information he wants to protect his image and position? A+ asshole, guys. Well done.
I thought bankers were all supposed to be heartless bastards.
Also, this might be a petty one, but since we're here, there's a throwaway case early in the episode surrounding something called the Jaria Diamond, which they could have very easily made the Blue Carbuncle or even the Mazarin Stone. I don't know why they didn't. It baffles me how many great opportunities they had for fan service that was sprinkled in so expertly in the previous episode, but they just didn't bother. Okay, enough about what this episode doesn't do. Let's talk about what it does do. While the mystery itself might not be the most elaborate in the series, it definitely feels like classic Sherlock Holmes, a bizarre incident that leads the boys on a search throughout several sectors of London. I found it really engaging and fun to follow the events as they unfold, especially as someone who spent a good chunk of my adolescence fascinated with cryptography and ciphers. A good mystery that involves cracking a secret code has my attention 9 times out of 10. I also got a kick out of seeing more of Sherlock's methods now that the introductions are out of the way. The casual deductions are still entertaining and plentiful. Watching him go to unconventional outside sources for more expert information needed for a case was a great detail, and the first instance of Sherlock in disguise, which for this Sherlock, instead of face plaster and wigs, is basically just acting. And most of the time, it's really convincing. While the more fast-paced and elaborate editing techniques have cooled down a bit in this episode, especially with the transitions, it's still present when following Sherlock's thought process and observations. And also, lots of floating letters and floating cipher characters. It all still gets the job done at showing what could be going through Sherlock's head and presents it creatively to the audience. They also had some fun with location shooting, since there are way more varied locations in this episode than there were in A Study in Pink. And they managed to make each reveal or revelation connected to the cipher feel chilling in a sense. John even shows how essential he can be tagging along with Sherlock on these cases, making significant contributions with gaining information on more than one occasion, which is really cool since the only major contribution he made during A Study in Pink was... It shows how these two can work together as partners instead of just a guy standing around impressed with his new friend's skills. And this is a small thing, but I really appreciate that John never tries to exploit Sherlock's abilities for money. With how much he's struggling to get the bills paid, it would have been so easy for John to push Sherlock into doing a case he didn't want to do because it's a high-paying one. But thankfully, Sherlock gets intrigued by Sebastian's case, and John just keeps an eye on the check. And once there are lives on the line and people are killed, they both pursue the case deeper regardless of whether it was what they were hired to do, because they both want justice to be done, and they are the only ones who can do it. I especially like this moment where they look over the victims they'd found, trying to find the thing that connects them. But specifically, I mean this line from John.
Why did they die, Sherlock?
It's small and probably not meant to be that meaningful, but to me, it illustrated the weight of John realizing the importance of what he's getting himself into, what Mycroft told him when they first met.
When you walk with Sherlock Holmes, you see the battlefield.
It's a lot to process, but John is willing to find the answers. Too bad Sherlock doesn't know how to open a door for him yet. Yeah, so about those growing pains. Throughout the investigation, it's clear that, like I said earlier, these two haven't quite gotten into the groove of being a team. Sherlock, for example, is constantly running off without John and leaving him locked out of rooms, which is one of the recurring jokes in the episode. And look, I get that Sherlock is used to working alone, but you'd think after how the good doctor saved your butt last time, you'd take a second to open a door, especially in places where you could be ambushed. And then he's ambushed, what a shock. But it is a detail I like. He's not intentionally neglectful, he's just not used to having someone tagging along with him who has something to contribute. Meanwhile, John's buttons keep being pushed because despite being interested in Sherlock's cases, he clearly didn't know what he was getting himself into. Not only is he agitated by being constantly left behind and ignored by his roommate, but trying to keep up with Sherlock during a case starts to take its toll. When Sherlock Holmes is on a case, it is his sole focus, and with an intriguing enough case, he can keep going on the adrenaline for days if that's what it takes to solve it. They even briefly mention Sherlock's tendency not to eat during elaborate cases. Meanwhile, John is just a person. Someone who's used to eating 3 meals and getting a decent amount of sleep, and constantly running around town trying to solve a string of murders interferes with those basic human needs on several occasions. From having to run out on lunch, to Sherlock immediately sending John back out to gather information after getting home, to sorting through hundreds of books from the victims to find the key to the cipher all through the night. For it turns out the life of a consulting detective isn't always glamorous. It's not just running after the bad guys. Maybe it's weird to say, but this aspect of John and Sherlock trying to subtly adjust to being a team is my favorite thing about the episode. Season 1 of Sherlock was all about these two learning to live and work together. Just the fact that John is the one concerned about the bills to the point that he gets a day job, presumably for the first time since he was discharged, speaks to the difference in their priorities. Seeing them adjust to those differences and develop into the classic partners in crime solving that everyone knows them as is one of the most appealing things about the first season to me. And this is the episode where that adjustment is definitely the most front and center. There's also one other aspect of John's life that takes a step forward in this episode, and is affected quite a bit from Sherlock's interference. Yes, we've got a love interest now, Sarah Sawyer, played by Zoe Telford. While Sarah does become a main part of the story in the second half, I don't have much at all to say about her. There's nothing annoying about Sarah, and I know she has fans. She's pretty understanding all things considered, and is willing to jump in to help John when they get attacked on their first date, but that's about it for Sarah. She's fine. And yes, this time I am okay with them not using a very obvious book reference, because they'll do something much better with that later on. Though the date with Sarah does have a joke at the expense of John's more infamous and promiscuous nature.
You want me to chase some killer while I'm trying to...
What?
While I'm trying to get off with Sarah? Hey...
Anyway, let's rewind a bit and talk a bit about the criminal in the story, or rather, criminals. Turns out the people leaving these ciphers and the connection to the two people killed are a gang of international Chinese smugglers. And this is another point where this episode might pale in comparison to the others. Both the previous episode and the one that follows in the season have one major villain, pulling the strings and able to orchestrate something big enough to call in Sherlock Holmes, making them very memorable characters. And yes, it is a little weird that a whole underground criminal syndicate leaves less of an impression than one person, but that's kind of how it comes across. Again, it's not bad, just not as interesting as what else the first season presents. Honestly, the paper Black Lotuses might leave more of an impact than any of the members themselves. Origami has never looked so threatening. Even though Origami is Japanese, not Chinese, but whatever. With that said, the most effective use of showing the power of the Black Lotus is when the guys finally find someone who used to work for them who's been in hiding. Su Lin Yao, played by Gemma Chan, who you might remember as Minerva in Captain Marvel, for all 10 of you who remember Minerva. This is probably due to Chan's performance, but watching Su Lin recount her backstory gets pretty emotional. Not the most emotional in the series by a long shot, but still, credit where credit is due. In fact, the museum scene as a whole is one of the best in the episode. The confrontation with the Black Lotus operative is gripping. This line from Sherlock is too great.
Careful! Some of those skulls are over 200,000 years old. Have a bit of respect.
And John hearing a gunshot in the distance and realizing Su Lin Yao's fate is really effective and surprisingly powerful. And while they have another run-in with the Black Lotus during John's date, the Black Lotus then come to confront them, or rather, confront John, because due to a whole bunch of out-of-context misunderstandings, the Black Lotus mistake John for Sherlock. I don't know if this is the right word to describe a man and his girlfriend being kidnapped and threatened through mistaken identity, but that was a pretty amusing twist, and definitely one that could only happen in the first season. The pieces that led General Shan to this assumption make sense, though the annoyed imitation used as a confirmation is a bit of a stretch to me. But using the attraction from the circus as a weapon is a nice callback. My favorite detail of this climax, though, is the role reversal from A Study in Pink. This time, Sherlock realizes John is in trouble and runs off to save him, which to me is a nice way to show that they've got each other's backs when it counts. They're both capable of getting the other out of life-threatening situations with criminal masterminds, which is good to know. Honestly, the most surprising thing about this whole ordeal is that John had another date with this girl after this. It's nice to see that Sherlock went to rescue Sarah first and foremost, but I'm stunned John didn't have any conversations about boundaries and not getting the girls he's dating in life or death situations after this mess. But while they were successful over the underwhelming underground crime syndicate, it turns out Shan and her organization were hired by a certain fan of Sherlock Holmes.
I will not reveal your identity.
Ending with one more ominous glance at this looming shadow before it envelops the events to come. Overall, The Blind Banker is a solid, if standard mystery, and not much else. While I do think this episode has a lot going for it, especially with the overarching character progression of the first season, and I have defended it more than once over the years, I will concede that it is the least interesting episode of the first season, and possibly the series as a whole. The mystery does add up and pieces well together, but it doesn't have too much to hook you for the 90-minute runtime. The production value is still polished and high quality, but not nearly as ambitious as A Study in Pink, and the lack of fan service and book-related callbacks when there were very easy places to do them were sorely missed on my end. It's not bad, it's just not as good as what we've seen. But one place where I think this episode excels is showing the progress of turning Sherlock and John from typical roommates to a mystery-solving team. And I appreciate how this episode in particular shows that that's going to take time. It let me see that Sherlock the series wanted to explore these characters I'd grown to love more than most adaptations I'd seen. And that's where most of my investment in this incarnation lies. The Blind Banker does stand out in one area though. It is the only average episode of Sherlock. After this, the episodes got way bigger, way more cinematic, and way more intricate. I think if the series had been produced as 9 60-minute episodes like it was originally intended, we would have seen a lot more cases like this one. And as much as I love Sherlock as it is, I have to admit, that's an alternate timeline I wouldn't mind a peek at. It may be a bit odd that the most remarkable thing about The Blind Banker is how unremarkable it is, but I know quite a few people who had a whole new appreciation for that as time went on. But next time, we'll be moving forward with the confrontation we've all been waiting for in the season 1 finale, The Great Game. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.